Hope you're having a great day today. And when I left you in the last mini lecture, I was talking a little bit about the allegory of the cave. Certainly, my discussion was not nearly as entertaining as the little video clip that you saw. Hopefully, that illustrated the allegory of the cave. For me, the significance of the allegory of the cave is that it's a powerful indictment, I think, of democratic societies because we proclaim the principle of one man, one vote, that everyone should participate, that everyone's vote is worthwhile. And yet, the criticism and critique, and certainly my good friend who teaches political science back east begins his American government course by saying that the greatest injustice in American government is that my vote counts the same as yours because the difference between my opinion and your opinion is that my opinion is an informed opinion. Well, certainly, that's what we're hearing here, right? Plato is saying that democracy has failed, and that the masses, and to be fair to Plato, keep in mind that the vast majority of people in Athens at the time of Plato only had uh, an elementary school education, and most of them had not even completed an elementary school education. But essentially, those with poor or mediocre knowledge are always going to outnumber the enlightened members of society. And certainly, whatever your political persuasion is, think about the appeals that are made often in political discourse. They're often very emotional, they're not very factually based. As I mentioned at the end of the last mini lecture, our founding fathers took this elitist view, and certainly Plato is an elitist. He's one of the highly educated, and of course, becomes a teacher himself. But our founding fathers took this view. I underlined it. Originally in the United States, only about 5% of people were allowed to vote. Only the House of Representatives was directly elected. Now, Plato makes a couple of observations that I find intriguing. And the first one is one where he has a major disagreement with his student Aristotle. Plato says that people do not engage in unjust behavior because they're inherently unjust. It's because they do not understand why their behavior is unjust, and basically they can be learned. And Aristotle rejects that and says that no, people know from an early age that their behavior is unjust or wrong. Plato ranks his political systems, and I find it quite interesting. Of course, we know what the preferred political system is, and I like the fact that Plato does try to rank political systems. Aristotle is going to give what I think is a much better classification in the next section, but this is a first attempt. And so, as he's ranking what would be ideal for him, obviously the philosopher king or queen, where justice and knowledge are the preferred values. I talked about that earlier. Second, democracy, courage or love of honor would be the preferred goal. This would be uh, ruled by the military leadership. The third would be an oligarchy, where a work ethic and wealth are the preferred values. Notice that fourth is democracy, the freedom to pursue necessary and unnecessary desires. Essentially, Aristotle dovetails on this and says that democracy is a bunch of people pursuing their selfish interest, and that it is a polity where you have a large number of people who are pursuing the public interest. But for Plato, a democracy is next to last in terms of his preferred political systems. The only thing worse than democracy in Plato's classification is a tyrant. And I think I mistyped that. A tyrant or despot, where you have an individual person who is pursuing both lawful and unlawful desires. Now, I want to add some things that aren't in your reading. That as I read through Plato, here are some things that are intriguing or interesting to me. First is the emphasis on public education for Plato. And here's an area where I have tremendous agreement with Plato. I think there should be a much more significant expenditure in public education. I got a higher education essentially for free. It allowed me to escape poverty and gave me upward mobility. And certainly, if I were in politics, greater access economically to higher education would be my number one priority. Plato was a critic of the private education of Athens, which only required an elementary education. Plato believed that this produced government by incompetence. Plato was way ahead of his time, in my opinion, advocating education for women, who, once again, even though Plato is considered an elitist, it's very intriguing that when it comes to leadership, both military and political leadership, Plato believes that women are equally capable of both military and political leadership as men. Plato's advocacy of education was shocking, revolutionary, if you will, at the time. Education for all men and women up to age 18, followed by 2 years of military training. So everyone would serve the state through military training. And there are countries today that have compulsory military duty. For potential guardians, that would be your philosopher king queen class. 15 years of advanced study. Think about that. Uh, for a law degree in America, you need 3 years beyond your bachelor's. For become a doctor, it's 4 years, maybe five in some specialties. But we're talking about 15 years here. So we're talking about double the time it would take to get a degree to practice medicine and law in our society. So 10 years in the sciences, including mathematics, astronomy, followed by 5 years of philosophy. At age 35, people would be assigned to civil and military administrative positions. During this 15-year period, they are apprentices, and only at age 50 could they join the guardian class. Uh, that is a tremendous, tremendous commitment in the abstract to think uh, that you would essentially give up 30 years, 15 years of education, 15 years of apprenticeship. This goes way beyond anything we see in any modern society. Uh, I mentioned female equality in the military and leadership positions, and Plato advocates kind of a communism for the guardian class, only the guardian class, and star that. I may ask a question that says Plato advocated a kind of primitive communism for what class of society? That would be the upper guardian class. The guardians would not be allowed to own private property. Once again, Plato is making an assumption that we see in later writers such as James Madison, as well as Karl Marx and others, right? Jean-Jacques Rousseau would be the most famous example, that private property uh, guides you towards pursuing self-interest rather than the public interest. Um, Personally, I'm a bit critical of this position, as you can read in your notes. The assumption is that the elimination of property interest would destroy the pursuit of self interest, as if property interests are the only motivation that is selfish. And I don't agree with that. I think that many people acquire power for power's sake, to achieve personal objectives, whatever they might be. And that may have little or nothing to do with property. I would also critique Plato, saying that I believe that As you read his theory, he destroys individualism. Really, all citizens lose their freedom. In my opinion, an individual's value does not lie solely in his relationship to the state. And I'm not nearly as cynical as Plato is. I do not believe, for example, that the majority of people are as greedy and inept as Plato makes them out to be. Certainly, you can find lots of examples of greedy people, and certainly you can find ineptitude in a lot of places, particularly, I would claim, in Washington today. But there's also a lot of people who are motivated by the public good. They want to do good. A lot of people, I believe, do have issues that they really want to fight for, and a lot of people want to make their societies better. So I would just say that I'm a little bit, not a little bit, I'm quite a bit more optimistic about people than Plato makes them out to be. But in conclusion, I agree with Plato on some things. I agree with Plato that his criticism of democracy cannot be lightly dismissed. There is no question that democracy is a difficult system of government to maintain because it consists of two contradictory elements. On the one hand, government and the majority in a democratic society have to have a certain amount of power, or I would call it authority, to govern. So individuals have to give up a certain amount of freedom for order, for a rule of law. But on the other hand, to live in a truly democratic society, there has to be a sphere of liberty and freedom that the majority cannot infringe upon. For those of you who took me for Political Science 1201, you may remember I started off the course with what I believe is the ultimate paradox of democratic societies, and that is that it is both a process. Democracy is about making decisions, so voting is an essential part of that. But it is also a set of principles and values that you want to protect. So, in a truly democratic society, yes, the majority needs enough power to govern, but individuals must have a sphere of freedom and of liberty that the majority cannot intrude upon. So, democracy is messy because it consists both of majority rule and minority rights. So, I believe that freedom is an essential part of a democracy, just as I believe order is. And the two do not coexist together very well. Plato, on the other hand, takes a very different view of freedom. Plato sees freedom as a disruptive power. Plato believes that freedom and the power of the majority is easily manipulated because most people have mediocre or poor knowledge. Plato believes that in democracies, there is a tendency for the demagogue to supplant wise, civic-minded statesmen. And here, Plato is going back to attacking the sophists, right? The sophists are interested in persuasion and oratory, and how do you get people to follow you? Not to follow good ideas, not to pursue the truth, not to make your society better, but merely to follow the person who is the most persuasive. And so Plato, and I think a lot of critics today, would say that one of the problems in many democratic societies is that the things that it takes to get elected as a candidate are very different than the things it takes to govern. So we see often excellent presidential candidates who turn out to be horrible at governing because the things it takes to get elected are very different than what it takes to govern.